we're thinking about this afternoon. And then we've got the tea break and the cream tea, and then we are going to think about how we can make sense of suffering. We live in a world with pain and suffering and evil in it. How do we make sense of that as Christians? And woven around that, we have time for some Q&A. So easy questions are welcome. Don't listen to what Dan said about Creation Fest. I love easy questions, but if you've got tough questions too, we'll have a go at those. And if you want to ask Dan a really tough question, by the way, feel free. I don't want him feeling lonely this afternoon. If you've got a really kind of tricky question, I'm sure he would welcome that only too much. He's waving at me not to do that. But anyway, let's dive into our first topic this afternoon and think about how we can talk about Jesus without looking like an idiot. That is the big elephant in the room for many of us who have a Christian faith. We're afraid if we talk about Jesus, we are going to look daft, we are going to look stupid, and so on. We're going to dive into that in a minute. Before we do, very quick housekeeping announcement. We're going to cover a lot this afternoon. So to help you get the most out this afternoon, I'm going to send a couple of clipboards around while I start. I'll start one over here, and I will start one over here. There we go, if we start this way. If you jot your email address down on that clipboard as it works its way around the room this afternoon, we'll do a couple of things for you at SOLAS, the organisation I work for. The first thing we'll do is we'll take your email and we'll sell it to Google. No, we won't do that. That was seeing if you were listening. No, promise we won't do that. What we will do, though, is we will send you the slides from this afternoon. So all the stuff that goes by on the screens, if you are a note-taking type, you don't have to try and write it all down or take photos. Feel free to do that. We will send you the slides from the 3 sessions early next week. Well, I now work as an evangelist. I spend a lot of my time talking to hostile audiences. You look like a friendly audience this afternoon. Thank you. But I sometimes have to talk to Anglicans, and all bets are off at that point. You can always tell who's in a room by who laughs and who just gives you a look. Spend a lot of my time talking to hostile audiences. I also do a lot of teaching and training like this. But I wasn't always in full-time Christian ministry. My first job was I worked for the health service. In fact, I worked for a place called St. George's Hospital Medical School in South London, near where I had been born. And I loved my time working for the health service in the 1990s. I worked on medical education. I helped the hospital organise training for doctors and particularly for psychiatrists. Huge fun working for the NHS for 6 or 7 years. But I look back on my time in the health service from the vantage point of 20 years on or so with not inconsiderable guilt. Because during my time working for the NHS, I confess I was very much an undercover Christian. In fact, I've long thought that Undercover Christian would make a great title for a movie, wouldn't it? About Christians sneaking around at work, university or wherever, hoping they would not be discovered that they are, in fact, Christians. In fact, when the TV show Silent Witness was announced a few years back, and I saw that advert, I thought they've done it. Someone's made a show about terrible evangelism. But it turned out it wasn't. It was about it was a police procedural thing. But I was an undercover Christian. What do I mean? What I mean by this, I was an undercover Christian in that outside of work, I was very actively involved in sharing my faith, in my local church, very involved in youth work and all kinds of church activities. But inside work, inside the hospital, I took my little light of faith and I stuck it under a bowl, and I put the bowl inside a box, and I surrounded the box by blackout curtains. Nobody was going to find out I was a Christian. In fact, the daftness of this was finally revealed to me when, after I'd worked for the hospital for 6.5 years, they threw me a leaving lunch. I had handed in my notice. If your workplace throw you a leaving lunch and you haven't resigned, there was probably a subtext. But I had resigned, they threw me a leaving lunch, and I discovered at this lunch that a woman who'd worked on the same corridor as me for the last 6 years, just 3 doors down, she was also a Christian. And she too had been playing undercover Christian. And we'd had 2 committed Christians on the same corridor, but we both kept our mouths shut, hadn't said anything, and we couldn't support and encourage one another. So what was going on? If you'd grabbed the kind of 25-year-old Andy Bannister and said, "What are you doing? Why are you an undercover Christian?" I think I'd have said to you a number of things. I think I would have said to you, well, I'm a bit nervous. And the kind of things I'm nervous about, well, I'm nervous, number one, of looking like an idiot. What if I try and share my faith at work and I do look totally stupid? Or in my more spiritual moments, I might have said to you, what if I try and share my faith with my colleagues and I do such a bad job, I make the gospel look bad or stupid. I think I genuinely thought I'd probably do more harm than good. So maybe the best thing to do is to say nothing. I think I'd have said to you things like, what about if I stand out from the crowd? Workplaces and schools and groups of friends can be very conformist environments, can't they? It can be quite a lot of courage to stick your head above the parapet, and I didn't have that courage, I confess, back then. And I think I'd have said to you too, well, I'm afraid of being asked a question to which I don't know the answer. What if I out myself as a Christian? I start talking about faith, and someone says, okay, Andy, you're a Christian, right? What about science? What about suffering? What about sexuality? What about a topic that begins with a letter other than the letter S? How tough would that be? And I thought it would be very tough, so I said nothing. Well, over the years, I have come to realize I was not alone in those fears. Survey after survey has shown that Christians are nervous about sharing their faith with their friends. In fact, a big survey came out just a few months ago revealing that, would you believe, that Christians are far less confident than Muslims are in talking about the things that they believe. I've just written a piece on that for Premier Christianity. Yet another survey showing that as Christians we are nervous. We are fearful as a wider community about talking about our faith. And maybe some of those issues on the PowerPoint slide there, maybe some of you this afternoon are nodding and going, yeah, I identify with that one. Or maybe if we had time to go in the room and say, are there things that hold you back from talking about Jesus, we would extend that list with other fears and other difficulties and other struggles. So this afternoon is designed to help us move beyond some of those. How do we move past some of those fears that hold us back from talking about Jesus with our friends? Well, I first got a really big insight into that when a few years ago I moved country. My family and I now live in Swindon. Before that, we lived in Dundee in Scotland. And before that, we lived in Toronto. That, by the way, is Toronto. That is not Swindon. And it's not Dundee. The Dundee skyline is much more impressive and has more haggis in it. Moved to Toronto in Canada. And shortly after moving to Toronto in Canada, I became friends with a guy in our church who was a Christian doctor. He was a GP. And very early on in one of our conversations, Pete said something that really made me sit up and take notice. He said to me, Andy, I love being a Christian and being a GP. It creates so many amazing opportunities for evangelism. And he shared how he'd prayed with patients, had conversations about faith with patients. He'd even had the privilege, the joy of being able to lead patients to Christ occasionally right there in the surgery. Now, this my ears pricked up because Canada is easily as liberal and progressive as we are here in the UK. And I know many medical professionals there and here who are terrified of talking about their faith at work for fear of what might happen. There was a story, I think, just 18 months ago about a Christian GP in this country who'd merely offered to pray with a patient and had almost been struck off by the BMA for that offer. And Canada is just as bad. So when Pete said those words, I remember looking at him and saying, okay, just slow down a minute. What is your secret? How have you been doing this for 10, 15 years, I think, by this point, and you haven't been fired? What are you doing? And he smiled. He said, well, actually, Andy, what I do is really simple. He said, when I have a patient in my surgery who's wrestling with something in life, they're obviously there for that kind of thing. He said, I'll do a little life audit with them. I'll say to my patient, okay, tell me about exercise. Are you exercising properly? Tell me about sleep. Are you sleeping properly? Tell me about diet. Are you eating properly? And he said, the last question I will always ask is, tell me about spirituality. Are you making space for that in your life? And he said, do you know what? Usually what happens is the patient will say, spirituality, what do you mean, doctor? And Pete will say, well, some people meditate, some people do yoga. I'm a Christian, so I read the Bible, I pray, I go to church, those kind of things. And he said, then what usually happens is the patient will say, you pray, doctor? How does that work? Or you go to church, but you're a man of science. Why would you do that? And he said, it's great because they're now asking me the questions. And I am totally free to answer if a patient asks me. If they don't want to go there, we don't go there. But he said so often, actually, they are keen to talk, and the conversations go in amazing places. And he's now been doing it, I think this now, for about 30 years actually, and still hasn't been fired. Is still working there in Toronto, still using this approach to evangelism, and still seeing God work through it in amazing ways. And when I first heard that story, it was a light bulb moment for me, because I realized at the center of what Peter was doing, the heart of his evangelism, was he had simply discovered the power of good questions. And underpinning all I want to share with you this afternoon is that simple idea, actually, that the most powerful tool we have in the toolbox for everyday conversations about Jesus with our friends and our neighbors and our colleagues is learning to ask really good questions. It's a very overlooked evangelistic tool. But the idea of using questions in spiritual conversations is not some new 21st century sort of trendy postmodern idea. It goes right back to the master question asker himself. It goes right back to Jesus of Nazareth. Somebody has counted. Somebody probably with far too much spare time or possibly insomnia has sat down and counted. And Jesus asks 307 questions in the Gospels. There's a fun figure that you can entertain people with. 307 questions. If you like stats, you'd also probably like to know he asks 83. He's asked 83, and he only answers 8 directly. But he asks 307 questions in the Gospels. So Jesus was a master question asker. And in particular, he was a master at responding to questions with questions. So let's start by taking a look at Jesus and see how he does it. And then I'm going to teach you 3 powerful questions that you can use this afternoon. 3 questions that you can take away and use again and again and again in conversation after conversation. Environmentally friendly evangelism for you this afternoon. But let's start with the master himself and take a look at how Jesus does it. And in Mark chapter 10, we have this story of Jesus and the rich young ruler. Let me just read you a couple of verses from the start of this encounter. Mark tells us, as Jesus started on his way, a man ran up to him and fell on his knees before him. "What, good teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "Why do you call me good?" Jesus replied. "No one is good except God alone." Well, the story goes on, but we'll just leave it there for a moment. And I wonder, as you hear me read these words and you see them on the screen, probably most of you in the room this afternoon have heard that story before, or perhaps heard that story spoken about or preached on before. But I wonder how often you found yourself stopping and scratching your head and thinking, what exactly was Jesus doing here? See, Jesus loved to do things that make us think, things that were a bit out of the ordinary. He liked to provoke people and get them thinking. And this is a textbook example, because this is a very strange response, demonstrated, by the way, proven by the fact that you or I would not automatically reach for it. So you think ahead to a few hours' time. I want you to imagine it's 8 o'clock this evening, and you are sitting on the couch at home, watching the telly, cup of tea in hand, when lo and behold, there comes a knock at the front door. And you get up from the sofa, you go to the front door, you open the front door, and it's your next door neighbor. And your next door neighbor looks at you and says, "Good Christian, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Your evangelistic Christmas has landed 2 months early. Who here is going to give this answer? "Why do you call me good?" Probably, if you're very bold, and you've been listening this afternoon maybe, you'll say, "Well, come on in, I've just been to a seminar on this kind of stuff. Come on in, the kettle's on, it's your lucky evening." If you're still a bit nervous, maybe you'll say, "I'll tell you what, I've got a book or a leaflet or a YouTube video I can share with you." And if you're a real chicken-hearted coward, maybe you'll say, "I'll tell you what, come to church with me next weekend and the pastor will answer that question." And of course, then you get on the phone, don't you, to this guy over here, or if you're from another church, ring the pastor up and say, "You've got to preach your best sermon on Sunday week. Best sermon, we've got a non-Christian guest coming." Yeah, a live one, not stuffed, a live one. So why doesn't Jesus take a more straightforward approach? Why doesn't Jesus say, "I'm the Son of God, follow me"? Why doesn't Jesus say, "Come to the Christianity Explored course or Alpha course that Peter, James, and John are leading. Sea of Galilee next Wednesday. Loaves and fishes supper. No scones, I'm afraid. Not invented yet." Well, maybe there was something going on in the life of this young man that Jesus had to deal with. And he had to deal with it. The best way to deal with it was with a question. You see, think about this for a moment. If you were to grab a non-Christian friend, if you've got a non-Christian family member, friend, colleague, neighbor, someone you know who doesn't have a Christian faith, and you were to grab hold of them for a moment and say, "Look, can you help me with a thought experiment? I want you to imagine for a moment there's a God. I know you don't believe in God, but just bear with me. I want you to imagine there's a God, and I want you to imagine there's a heaven. What do you think you would need to do to get there if those two things existed? What do most of our friends think is the answer to that question? If there were a God and if there were a heaven, how would you go? What do people think? Yeah, look, well done. Yeah, fantastic. This is not the trick question. That comes later. Yeah, be good. Absolutely. That's the most common answer you hear from people. Be a good person, be a good citizen, be a decent person. And if there is a God, then hopefully, I'll be in heaven because I've lived a nice life. And this is what this young guy is basically saying to Jesus, isn't he? This young man is looking at Jesus and saying, well, Jesus, you are clearly a good man. You're a famous rabbi. Everyone hangs off your every word. Amazing stuff going on through your ministry. Jesus, you're clearly a good man. So tell me, how do I get to heaven on that basis? Jesus could have untangled that with a parable, with a sermon, with a clever saying. He does it with a question. Because when Jesus turns to the young guy and says, why do you call me good? Only God is good. He's basically saying to the young man, he's basically saying, you know what, son, you're absolutely right. All good people do go to heaven. You're dead right. But here's the thing. Who is good? And I'm telling you, only God is good. So all good people go to heaven. Only God is good. Who gets to go? Only God on that basis, I'm afraid. And by the way, what then happens if you read on in the story, of course, this opens up the bigger question of who is Jesus, right? Because if the young man has seen that Jesus is good, but only God is good, who is Jesus in this conversation? And then when Jesus turns around in a moment and says, you know what, you need to sell all your money, give it away and follow me, that claim looks ludicrous if this is just a wandering rabbi from Galilee. On the other hand, if this is the very Son of God in front of the guy, all bets are off. And Jesus does all of that work just by asking a question. Questions can be very powerful. So why don't we learn from Jesus and start using them a bit more ourselves? So I'd like to introduce you this afternoon to 3 really simple questions that you can learn to use in everyday conversations. They're like a question-asking starter pack to get you going. The questions I'm going to introduce you to this afternoon are the what do you mean by that question? Then we're going to look briefly at the why do you think that question? And then lastly, our third question in this first session, have you ever wondered? First 2 questions are designed to help you stay in a conversation. If you're afraid that somebody might ask something or raise an issue that you can't answer, those will really help you. And the third question can help you start spiritual conversations with people who outwardly might not say they're interested. But let's take a look at them in order. So the first question on my list then, what do you mean by that? Let me illustrate how this works with a scenario. Let's imagine that later in the week you're riding the bus, somewhere in the town down in Penzance or wherever it is you work and hang out in the week. You're on the bus, and perhaps you're going to work, going to school, going to visit a friend. You're on the bus. And like every Christian on public transport, right, you are sitting there on the bus reading the biggest, blackest, leather-bound Bible you could get your hands on. It is massive. No cheeky reading the Bible on an iPhone for you. You are very out there with your Bible reading, like we all are, right? And who should get on at the next bus stop but an old school friend that you haven't seen for about 10 years. And your friend gets onto the bus stop, sits down next to you, looks at the Bible, which they could hardly miss, let's be honest, and they launch into a tirade. They say, oh, what? You're not still into that religion rubbish, are you? Only idiots believe in God. There is no evidence that God exists. The only reason anyone believes in God is they are too weak psychologically to get through life without belief in the sky fairy. And it's all a load of rubbish. And as their words die away, you find yourself thinking, well, this is why they're an old friend, because they used to do this stuff 10 years ago. It got boring then. And you also notice that everybody else on the bus has heard what's been said. The people are stopping their conversations and leaning in to listen to yours. People are taking their headphones out with a kind of, this will be interesting look on their faces. Your palms are sweating. Your adrenaline needle is in the red zone. Your heart is racing. You think, well, I could pull the emergency button cord thing and just run. I could pray for the second coming. Lord, I know you're going to come again, but please now would be really helpful. Or you could use the what do you mean by that question. You see, what if you looked at your friend and said, well, thank you for that. I just have a couple of questions, if I might. You said only idiots believe in God. What do you mean by that? What precisely is it that you think is idiotic about faith? Can you unpack that? You described Christianity. The only people who believe in God are psychologically weak. Again, what do you mean by that? I find it quite hard being a Christian in a secular society. Atheists get on buses and accost me, for starters. Evidence was mentioned. You might say, hey, you mentioned there's no evidence that God exists. What do you mean by the word evidence? What would you need to see or hear to persuade you that maybe there was something going on here? And then, by the way, you can pick up on the other word they used, God. You used the word God a couple of times. When you say God, just out of interest, what do you mean by that? I've asked atheist friends that question and sometimes been told things like, well, I don't believe in the guy with the big beard and the lightning bolts up there in the sky. To which I always like to grin and go, that's great, I don't either. That sounds like a strange mashup of Thor and Father Christmas, which is not what Christians believe in. If you have a moment, I can tell you what I do believe in. And any one of those approaches increases the chance that you can start a conversation here. And success for me, by the way, would simply look like you create enough space that you can say to your friend when you get off the bus, do you know, this has been really interesting. Why don't we grab a coffee next time you're in Penzance and we can talk properly, you know, and not have an argument. I'd love to grab a coffee with you and talk more about these things if you'd be interested. And what do you mean by that question? It's just designed to help you get a kind of foot into the conversation and the confidence that no matter what comes at you, you've got a question that will start you into the conversation. Well, our second question this afternoon is pretty similar, actually. The why do you think that question? Again, let me just illustrate with a scenario. Let's imagine this time that you're in the workplace. If you work in an office environment, just think of your workplace. If not, just imagine that you're in a large open plan office. It's Monday morning, and like every Christian in the workplace, in a secular workplace, there on your desk in front of you is your laptop computer, your mug of coffee, and your big black leather Bible. Every Christian here in the workplace, right? We take that in, don't we? In fact, you're so keen, you've got one of those big Victorian preaching numbers, complete with the wooden eagle lectern underneath it. You are that eager. And suddenly a shadow falls across your desk as a colleague walks by. And your colleague looks at you, and she sees the Bible, and your colleague just remarks with a sneer, oh, for goodness sake, why would you bring a Bible into a place of work? Load of old rubbish. It's an Iron Age book full of myths and legends and superstitions, and it's riddled with contradictions. You know, why would you bother with it? And you notice a couple of things. Again, like your friend on the bus, she said this rather loudly. So other people in the office are kind of looking around from their workstations with well, this will be an interesting Monday morning look on their faces. You can see one colleague even getting popcorn from under his desk and kind of munching away with a happy look. Christians versus Lions, round 2. And just to make this entertaining, this is not just any colleague who said this. She's a senior manager. So if you get a bit too lippy, score 10 out of 10 for evangelism, but you might fail next week's performance review, and that would be a bad thing. So what do you do? Well, again, this is where a question can really help. What if you were to look at your colleague and say, well, thank you for what you just said. I've heard other people say similar things before, but I just wonder, could you help me out? What is it that you've read or seen or studied that's led you to that conclusion about the Bible? I'm really intrigued how you got to that viewpoint. Now, from having tried this, the most likely thing you'll hear is she will say words to the effect of, well, everybody knows. Which is shorthand for, I was on YouTube last night and I saw Ricky Gervais say it and it sounded clever and I've just repeated it and he wasn't asked to justify it. Help. And again, don't get lippy. Just go, oh, you know, maybe we need a bit more than that. Maybe with really important questions of life, we need more than just, I saw it on YouTube. Or you might mention contradictions. Hey, you said there were contradictions in the Bible. Just out of interest, which ones did you have in mind? When you've looked at the Bible, what is it that you've seen there that's given you difficulty? Now, again, you may get a brush off which is translated into, I haven't got any first clue here, or she might have something. And now this was the fear that kept me shut up as an undercover Christian in a health service. What if I ask that kind of question and they come back with something you don't know the answer to? Because if you know the answer, just share it. What happens if the follow-up is something you don't know the answer to? Well, here, all you have to do is be very friendly and say, well, that's a really interesting idea that you've shared there. Do you know what? I don't immediately know the answer, but I'm a Christian who likes to be thought through, and so leave it with me. I will find the answer and come back to you, and be true to your word, by the way. You know, do an internet search, read a book, talk to an older, wiser Christian, talk to a pastor. If you attend this church, Dan over here, I can guarantee at about 3 a.m, he's bored. He's done his sermon prep, he's prayed for everybody, and he's sitting there thinking, what should I do with my life? He will appreciate a phone call in the small hours asking him a really difficult question. No, joking aside, ask an older, wiser Christian, find the answer, because then you've got a brilliant opportunity to go back in the week or 10 days ahead and knock on your colleague's door and say, hey, thank you for that really good question that you asked in the office of the week? I did some work because I really wanted to find an answer, and I found an answer. Would you be interested? May I share with you what I found? Now, if you do that politely, there's a massive chance your colleague's going to say, well, come on, what have you got then? And then you've got a conversation going. And you've gone from a really scary encounter to actually a conversation happening, and you've done it using a question. But what if your colleagues and your friends and your fellow travelers on buses are not flinging anti-Christian hand grenades around the place? What if a lot of your friends are like a lot of my friends, and they are simply disinterested? You know, if you try and raise spiritual things, they'll say, I'm not into God, I'm not religious, I'm not interested. There's a lot of that going on. The last UK census here, back in 2021, revealed that 25% of Brits would put themselves in that category, the I'm not interested in religion category. How do we start conversations with folks in that kind of area? Well, this is where the last question I'm going to teach you this afternoon, before I say a little bit about Solas and we have our first mini break. Well, the third question rides to the rescue, the have you ever wondered question. And let me show you how this works, not with a kind of funny example, but with a real world story in this case. So I've got a friend who works as a teacher at a high school in Plymouth. And John is a Christian, very committed Christian, but like many Christians working in things like education, he has to be very careful what he says or doesn't say to his colleagues and particularly his students. But he's discovered that if he learns to ask what he introduced to me as wondering questions, all kinds of amazing things can happen. And he told me of an example of where he first did this. A few years ago, John was teaching a class of 15-year-olds. He was teaching them a class on moral philosophy and human rights and so on. And to illustrate a point, he put this picture on the screen. This is the cover of Time magazine from the 8th of August 2010. And a very famous cover. It won photojournalism awards around the world, and it portrays the beautiful but mutilated face of a young girl called Bibi Asia. Who is she? Well, at the time of this story, she was a 14-year-old Afghan teenager. She had been forcibly married off to a Taliban warlord in his 50s. He had proceeded to horribly mistreat and abuse her, so she had run away from the home. They had captured her, cut off her nose, cut off her ears, and left her to die, bleed to death. Thankfully, she was rescued by UN aid workers, flown to the West, given reconstructive surgery, and if you Google her today, very different story. It's amazing the transformation that's happened. But quite the story. So John told this story, showed this photo. Then he asked his class of 15-year-olds, he said, okay, who here thinks that what was done to Bibi Asia was wrong? John said to me, thankfully, every hand in the class went up. It is never a good day when you discover a psychopath in the back of the class on a Friday afternoon. But then John asked the follow-up question. He said, okay, who can tell me why it's wrong? He said this time there was a slightly longer pause before finally one sort of enterprising student in the back row called out, well, they violated our human rights, Mr. Broadbanks. They violated our human rights. That's what's wrong. And John was able to say, great answer, Sarah. Well done, great answer. Okay, why is that wrong? Why is it wrong to violate someone's human rights? And John said for the next 5 or 10 minutes, students would offer suggestions, and he would simply smile politely and go, but why? Finally, one kid in the front row, he said, literally started punching the table with his fist and going, well, it's just wrong, sir, isn't it? It's flipping wrong. It wasn't quite the word he used, but you get the idea. And John was then able to say, interesting. Do you know, have you ever wondered why it is that we are so passionate about human rights? Why none of us have looked at this photo and gone, well, maybe that's okay in Afghanistan. Why is it that we instinctively think this? Why do we give human rights to human beings and not to ants and aardvarks and eggplants? And that led him the opportunity to introduce another wondering question, where after that discussion, John was able to say, do you know, have you ever wondered if what you believe about God is really important here? If you believe there is some kind of God, it makes perfect sense to talk about human beings have value and dignity because God has created us that way. If you don't believe in God, this afternoon he said to his students, if you believe we are just a collection of atoms in motion, then good luck to you trying to get to human rights on that basis. Or John said not merely was it an amazing conversation with his class, it was an amazing conversation with his head of department who had been at the back of the class observing the lesson that afternoon. This man, a self-described agnostic, a man who had always tried to sort of respond to John's attempt to start spiritual conversations by saying, I'm just not interested in those kind of things. In the tea break that afternoon, this guy came bouncing up to John in the staff room and said, "Mate," he went, "that was an amazing conversation, amazing discussion you led with the kids back in that period. It never before occurred to me that human rights is a totally stupid idea if there is no God out there." And John replied, "Well, I don't think I was quite that directive with the students, but basically, good summary of the class, yes." Then his colleague added, he said, "Maybe more things stand or fall on belief in God than I'd really probably thought about before." And John was able to say, I would agree with you. I think human rights, yeah, but other things too." And then his colleague even more amazingly added, he said, "I have to admit that for some time now, I've kind of taken the God question and kind of stuffed it under the table and tried not to think about it. Maybe it's time I began thinking about it properly." And John was able just very naturally to say, "That sounds like a great idea. And any time you want to have that conversation, I would happily take you out for a sandwich or a beer after work, and we can have that conversation." And John did all of that by asking a wandering question. And in short, what you do with a wandering question, you are looking for something that your friend is already interested in. Human rights and justice is a big one in today's age. But there are other things that our friends are passionate about that really don't make total sense when it comes to making sense of them in a godless world. Why do we love natural beauty and art? Why do we get upset at greed and injustice? Why do we believe that we need to do something about the environment and the mess that human beings have made of it? The list goes on and on and on. And with practice, you can begin listening for the things that your friends already care about and find a way of gently asking wandering questions to connect to the gospel. And by the way, if you want a biblical example of this, where time is against us, but later on this evening or later in the week, take a look at Acts chapter 17 sometime, where Paul is in Athens, and we're told he wanders around and he comes across his altar to the unknown God. And he preaches this amazing evangelistic message, beginning effectively by asking a wandering question. Have you folks wondered who this unknown God is that you've built an idol to? And he quotes their own poets at them. He's listened carefully. He understands who he's speaking to. And he preaches this powerful gospel message all around a wandering question. So as this first session begins to come to a close, 3 questions for you this afternoon. What do you mean by that? Why do you think that? And have you ever wondered? And it is my firm belief that if we try and we practice and we give asking questions a go, and we surround all that by prayer, and we pray for opportunities to ask questions in the lives of our friends, we listen in those conversations, we listen to our friends, we listen to how the Spirit's leading us, but we take the Jesus approach and think about the questions we should be asking, God can work in tremendous ways. We live in an incredibly spiritually open age right now, actually. There are challenges out there, but also survey after survey showing that people are beginning to ask big questions about the big questions of life. I think a huge opportunity in our culture right now as followers of Jesus to say those questions that you have should point you, when you think about them, to the one who is the answer to them all, Jesus Christ. And I hope as you do that, you would find opportunities to share Jesus naturally. Well, thank you for listening very patiently for the first kind of 25 minutes, half an hour or so, even laughing at some of the dad jokes. There'll be more to come, I kind of warn you. Let me now just talk to you a little briefly about SOLAS, the organisation that's partnered with the church here to bring you Confident Christianity this afternoon, and then we'll give you guys a 10-minute stretch break. So SOLAS is the SOLAS Centre for Public Christianity. We're a Scottish-based evangelism and training organisation. SOLAS is the Gaelic word for light. If anyone's wondering, we are not an acronym. If you Google SOLAS as an acronym, you get the safety of life at sea. That is not us. If you fall in the water out there, call them. If you're trying to witness someone who's fallen in the water, call them and call us. But we do 2 things at SOLAS. The first thing we love doing, we love working with churches and Christian groups on places like universities to take the gospel out of the 4 walls of the churches and into the public square. We help churches put on events in cafes and pubs and workplaces, and when we do that, we see amazing things happen. A few months ago, we were doing an event like that up in Aberdeen, with one of the big churches up there, and the church hired this new restaurant around the corner from the church. They sold tickets to the event in pairs. You were not allowed to come as a Christian unless you brought a non-Christian friend. But how easy to say, would you like to come to this new wine bar that's opened? I've got you a ticket. So we had a lovely evening of coffee and dessert, and then I got to stand up and talk about, given all the chaos in the world, where is hope to be found, 20-minute talk, Q&A afterwards, and then afterwards the conversations around the tables as people talk to their friends. And the highlight of the evening for me was actually as we were packing up at the end, we'd had about 12 people sign up for the Alpha course, which was amazing. We had this young guy who was one of the serving staff, came over to talk to me. Turned out he was a university student who worked shifts at the restaurant in the evening. And he said, Andy, have you got a moment? And we chatted. He said, this is fascinating. I was listening to you while you talked this evening. He said, I come from an atheist background. Mum and dad don't believe in a thing. My grandparents don't believe in a thing. Never been to church. He said, but, in the last few months, I've begun realizing that it doesn't satisfy. There are too many big questions out there, bigger than that. And he said, then in the last few weeks, I've found myself accidentally in 3 different Christian events. That was a lovely description, accidentally in 3 different Christian events, including this one. And he said, it's really compelling. I could imagine how, I don't know, in a year's time, I might have transitioned. That was the word he chose for taking Christianity seriously. But what do I do? And it was brilliant to be able to say, well, let me introduce you to the pastor. And they got this great thing called Alpha starting, free food. He was a student, his eyes lit up, and a chance to ask questions. And I was really struck afterwards by how many people like him I meet among young people now. Huge openness out there, and we love helping churches reach those kind of folks. We also do a lot of teaching and training around the country. Don't need to talk to you about that because you are there in the middle of a training event. You're at one of our training events. We run Confident Christianity all over the country. The last year we have been as far north as the wee highlands of Scotland, way up in the far north. And earlier in the year we're on Jersey. And in fact next week I'm on Guernsey working with Elim Church on Guernsey, doing a big outreach to the local kind of schools as well as some events like this. So we get across the whole country and we get excited about helping folks like you get more confident in talking about your faith with your friends. Huge number of digital resources to help you do that. On your seats today, you should have found a little white leaflet, a bit like this one. I'll let you take that away and dig into that at your leisure. Do encourage you to check out the SOLAS kind of website. Loads of resources on there to help you go deeper into stuff we're talking about this afternoon, and really lots of resources too to help you share your faith with your friends. Just to mention one of those resources, we have a series on the SOLAS website of short videos called Short Answers. They are 3 to 4 minute videos addressing common questions or objections about the Christian faith. And if you want ways to start conversations, or you're nervous that if someone asks you a question about your faith, how would you answer? Short Answers is very much your friend. We have seen so many amazing things happen as people have shared those on social media over the last 3 or 4 years we've been running that series. In fact, one of my favorite stories of God at work came earlier in the year when a pastor in Scotland emailed us to say a guy had walked into his church on Sunday morning and announced he'd become a Christian a week or so before and was now looking for a church. And the pastor had asked him, well, this is amazing, so what's your journey to faith? And it turns out this guy had stumbled across the SOLAS website and watched 180 short answer videos from beginning to end, which was not how they were designed. But he said, I got to the end and every question I can possibly have was answered. And then I watched the one on how to become a Christian, so I kind of prayed the prayer they talked about. What do I do now? Which is amazing. I wish every story was that dramatic, but that's a wonderful one. So that's what SOLAS does. I would now just love to ask if you folks would consider getting involved with what we do. You've partly done that by coming here this afternoon. That's great. But 3 ways I would just like to put in front of you as we head into the first stretch break. 3 things I'd really value your help with. Firstly, would really just ask if you would consider praying for us. If you put your name down on the clipboard as it's gone by, as well as the slides, we'll send you some occasional prayer updates on what we're doing as a team. It makes a huge difference to know, all jokes aside, if one of my colleagues is standing in front of a school or a university or a secular crowd, or if I'm doing a debate with a Muslim or an atheist, knowing that there are people around the country praying for the work of SOLAS. So just would really encourage you to think about that, if that's something you can remember in your prayers from time to time. Secondly, my request this afternoon would be just consider making use of the many free materials on the SOLAS website. One of the things I think we're very good at doing as Christians is coming across really good evangelism resources, and then we kind of go, oh, that's great, and we enjoy it ourselves, and we don't share it. Really encourage you and challenge you. Take a look at some of the materials there, perhaps some of the books available at the end and so on, and think, okay, how can I actually share that with somebody rather than just get personally encouraged that there's an evangelistic resource. Let's get things out of the church. Because be amazed what happens when we have the boldness to do that. And then thirdly, SOLAS is not funded by large organizations with big pockets. I wish that were the case. Life would be easy. But we get to do the work that we do because of hundreds of Christians around the country who give us a small amount of money monthly. There may be some SOLAS donors here this afternoon. If you are a SOLAS supporter, a huge thank you. If you're not, just if I might ask you, cheekily ask you to prayerfully consider we might you become one today. On your seat as well, you'll find this little A5 leaflet. The way we do this is if you sign up this afternoon for as little as £3 a month to support the work of evangelism that I've described and all the other activities and ministry that we're involved in, as a thank you, come and see me in the coffee break or at the end, not the 10-minute break, but the coffee break or at the end, and I will give you, as a thank you, a free book. We have my bright yellow How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot. We've drawn a bit from that this afternoon, but there's a lot more there. We also we would actually give you not one, but 2 copies of the new book we brought out at SOLAS called Have You Ever Wandered? You might recognize the question on the title. And there are 28 chapters in there asking wandering questions about a whole range of things. This is an evangelistic giveaway book. That's why we're offering 2. You can keep one on your shelf and enjoy it and give one to a friend. And we have been amazed since this came out on the 1st of April. We've sold 30,000 of these, have gone out around the country. And the way that God is using it is so exciting. We get different stories in every week. And in fact, I'll leave you with this story of this book before we go into our 10-minute break. I've got a friend of mine in Scotland, his name is Ian, and he travels a bit for work, and he's an aviation buff. So about a couple of months ago, he went to a place called Duxford, which I don't know if you were aware of, some of you may know that. That's the big RAF museum over on the east of the country. And he was wandering around there doing what nerds do, taking photographs and things. And he bumped into a guy in uniform. And it turned out this other visitor there was an American pilot from the American Air Force Base next to Duxford. And they got chatting over planes and things. And this American pilot offered my friend Ian a book that he had all about the American Air Base. To which Ian said, "Oh, that's very kind, thank you." And then he reached into his own bag and Ian brought out a copy of Have You Ever Wandered? And gave it to this pilot as a return gift. Well, 2 weeks later, Ian gets an email from this new friend of his saying, "Thank you so much for that book you gave me when we met the other week." He said, I would have described myself as having had some kind of faith when I was young, but I walked away from that and abandoned that in my 20s. But that book has helped me rediscover Christian faith, and I'm now going back to church again. Thank you so much for giving me the book. Well, that was exciting enough. 3 weeks after that, Ian gets another email saying, "Could you send me 10 copies of the book? Because I'm now talking about my faith with other people on the base, and I want to give them the resource that you gave me." And that's one of my favorite stories of God working through books. God can do amazing things through books. That book will help you do that. I've been talking long enough. We've now got a 10-minute break. Anything you want to say about that, Dan? Any practical things other than have a coffee, tea, have a stretch, use the washrooms, do a little bit of line dancing, Google how to spread a scone?